Good morning from Alpbach, and welcome on a sunny, not so rainy day to discuss with myself, Sam Jones from the Financial Times, our session Voices of Transformation. I'm joined by Katrin Eggenberger, the Minister for Justice, Foreign Affairs and Culture of the Principality of Liechtenstein, and by Ralf Beste, the Ambassador to Austria from Germany. Good morning to you both. We've got quite a broad topic this morning to discuss, covering everything in the post-COVID world to do with how the pandemic is transforming our global institutions, trust in those institutions, the way people and populations engage with them, and the threats to society that are being exacerbated by the pandemic. Maybe the best place to begin is if you could each give me some of your thoughts on how the pandemic is transforming the world we live in, and what problems it's going to throw up for the future, and maybe as well, even dare I say, what opportunities there are from both a European and international point of view for politicians and people to take from this. Could we start with you, Frau Minister?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to speak today in this session. What a topical topic, to be honest. I mean, everything is around that topic at the moment, and of course there are threats, and I see that as well. The COVID crisis has a far-reaching impact, in my view, with additional challenges for international peace and security as well on top of. And at this point in time, it is probably too early to tell how exactly this will affect international power structures and specifically also power interests or also the world order in the longer term. So what we definitely know today is that the crisis is leading to severe economic consequences, including high levels of unemployment, and it definitely puts democracy under pressure. And emergency measures restrict, for example, freedom of movement, as we saw it, and public assembly, and risking to undermine fundamental rights and liberties, in my view, to look at the whole topic as a whole. These triggers can spark social unrest. We also saw that lately, and political instability, and they also fuel existing conflicts or could lead to new ones. So definitely what you just mentioned with the threats. As we all know, the crisis has come at a time when multilateralism has already been under pressure. At the same time, it offers a window of opportunity, in my view, to reignite a more cooperative approach that will lead to more sustainable solutions, hopefully. So I also see hope in this time of crisis, but definitely multilateralism, and we also had a panel yesterday about multilateralism that has already been questioned before, is even more questioned right now.
I suppose, especially in an environment where the traditional power centers in the world, you look to Washington or maybe increasingly to China, those are not places anymore that are inclined to support multilateralism. So maybe it's a key European challenge as well. Ambassador, what are your thoughts on this very broad topic?
Well, I agree with what the Minister said. Maybe we can distinguish two levels where things are changing or where the challenges arise. One is, to say it in an abstract way, the world order question. I mean, in hindsight, although world politics has always been exciting over the last 30 years, we lived in a rather carefree environment because we felt that everything was under control and everything was moving in our direction. European Union, our neighborhood, strove for being member or being as close as possible. And on the world stage, we felt that liberal Western democracy had won the day. And even more than that, everything was moving in our direction, as I said. So, and this has been changing over the last 10 years, I'd say. International law has been violated by big players with impunity, largely with impunity. I don't have to quote the single instances, but we are challenged by infringements of international law, and the challenges to multilateralism that you mentioned are there. So, and I'm afraid many of these developments are only gaining speed. The trust in rulings of international law and that those will protect your interests as a nation state has evaporated to a certain extent. So nations try to secure their interests in different ways. That has been changing. At the same time now that we see with COVID is the that's by and large a question of sovereignty. How do you deal with your interests? Do you think that multilateralism is going to take care of that? Or do you rather rely on your own proper decisions in order to make sure that you survive the day? The next thing is the interdependency. We thought that interdependency would alleviate the threat of conflict. That was what the European Union was all about all the time. And the cooperation and dependency would make war, conflict, not feasible anymore, not interesting, and not gainful in any way. And now we see that interdependency in the COVID crisis suddenly turns out to be a vulnerability of our systems. How do we fare with that challenge? That's one thing that COVID is certainly putting. And on another level, if you go below the world order thing and look at nation states, what we see in Europe is the emergence rather quickly of something like a European public, because the European people compare how do their respective nation states cope with the crisis, how resilient are the systems. So governments come under pressure to show that they are better, quicker, more responsible and more effective in their COVID response than the others, or at least as good. So there is a new debate: is our respective system sufficiently resilient to cope with a crisis? And that is essentially a question of legitimacy, of trust of the people into the system that they live in.
I mean, obviously, between the two of you, there's a huge range of issues there that we've touched on. Maybe we could start by just looking at that, taking the ambassador's last point about that sort of resource nationalism almost that the crisis is bringing back, where countries, maybe because of an existing absence of faith in multilateral institutions and because of the pressure they're under, are increasingly looking to safeguard their own interests. And here in Europe, even within the European Union, there was that in the early stages of the pandemic, there was almost a sense of every country for themselves. Was that something you recognise as having had a lasting effect, or do you think within Europe now countries are working together more effectively to deal with this, or is it still very fractured? Maybe we could start with Liechtenstein, being one of sort of smaller countries on the continent.
Of course, one of the smaller ones, definitely. One of the ones that really rely on the neighbours. So it was for us a very intense time, to be honest, because the smaller the country, the more important it is to have multilateralism, to really cooperate. And we've had very great cooperations with our neighbours so far, with Switzerland and Austria, but also Germany. And so we are among the lucky ones, as we speak the same language, so we have close bounds and we also could build on those. But just to add up very quickly on what the ambassador just said, in my view, we should really build on the system that we have. I mean, we should effectively use the existing global and regional platforms. And it's not only the United Nations. When we speak about Europe, it's the OSCE that we should really build on and use in that regard.
But does the OSCE, do you think that has a public health element to the security mandate? I mean, how does that fit together with the current crisis, do you think?
No, specifically what I mentioned in the introduction about security as such, because I feel that in confronting COVID-19, we also need to tackle the pandemic spillover effects on security, which I feel specifically in that regard, a comprehensive and cooperative approach to security like the one that the OSCE is having is, in my view, like really of particular relevance, and also bearing in mind the multifaceted consequences of the crisis as such, but not in terms of the health topic, but specifically the security, because I feel today's biggest security challenges are global. And so like the pandemic, they transcend borders and demand cooperative responses. And COVID-19 must not stop diplomatic efforts to respond to conflicts or prevent us from seeking cooperative approaches to shared challenges. So that's why for us, the OSCE, and specifically us as a country, not even having a military as such, we really rely on partners like the OSCE.
Yeah, I mean, the OSCE is an interesting example of a multilateral organisation that is currently having difficulties. I mean, Ambassador, you're sat in Vienna, so what's your view about how, specifically at the OSCE, what's the way forward now in terms of its current leadership and sort of resolving some of the tensions there, and also what does that tell us about the utility of other multilateral organisations? That, I mean, we've talked a lot about how we need them, but most of them are failing in their core tasks at the moment, aren't they?
Well, I mean, the OSCE has been in difficult circumstances for quite a while. I'm only watching that from the sidelines because we have an ambassador to the OSCE, and I'm in Vienna. I'm close up, but not too close inside that. But as we see in the states that formerly belonged to the Soviet Union are posing very many challenges to the cohesion of the OSCE, but at the same time, that was what the OSCE was always about. We wanted to establish common standards for countries that were very diverse. So it would be obsolete if there weren't any problems anymore, if we were on the same page with Tajikistan and Azerbaijan and so on. So it's still worthwhile pursuing that, but it's obvious that that those very many tiny and sometimes bloody regional conflicts that the OSCE are dealing with need a common approach, and we need a lot of patience and resilience in order to address that. But right now, as we see, that's difficult. But the most prominent example of where the OSCE is proving its worth is in Ukraine, where all these missions to monitor the ceasefire and so on would not exist if we didn't have the OSCE. So better do not discard something lightly because you have a problem with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, going back to your point earlier about the sort of golden period, perhaps before 2008, I don't know when you date the end of it, where a lot of these institutions the faith in them was increasing, or the European project, people were that was expanding, and people had a solid vision of what it would be in the future, and then obviously we had the financial crisis and all manner of other crises since. In these multilateral institutions, has that sort of exposed a lot of maybe complacency about the role that they played? Now that the OSCE functioned for many years, and then more recently it's been under a huge amount of stress. The same with other institutions, where not just the former USSR, but now in Asia, you look at sort of the rise of China as well. What's going on in Hong Kong, the institutions that previously appeared to be holding everyone to account and bringing everyone to the same table are now, people sort of view them as failing because there's too much disagreement within them. But it sounds like you're saying that that's natural, that there should be disagreement.
That is the challenge to multilateralism. I mean, we had another panel where we talked about multilateralism at length, and one of the issues when it comes to public acceptance is that more than half of the people don't understand what multilateralism is at all, and very many people have difficulties pronouncing it, as I'm proving right now. So it's about international cooperation on a long-term and committed, binding, responsible way, and that means that you do not only establish memberships and rules, but that you obey to these rules, even if it is against your short-term interests, and that's a long shot for a nation state. So this challenge has been around for all those 70, 80 years that we have established this multilateral system. And the very concept of an effective multilateralism that came into being 20 or 30 years ago already shows a certain discontent with the production of results. If you say you want to have it effective, you're not happy with only having multilateral institutions, but you want to see results. And that's always difficult. The broader the group is that you try to incorporate to make meaningful moves ahead. The European Union is probably the most refined and advanced multilateral organization, and it shows it's always difficult if you want to make meaningful progress in any one direction to bring everybody on board. And maybe to go back to your question, as to the crisis response, once we looked into this corona abyss together and we resorted in the first moment of shock to national solutions, blocking of protective gear, closing of borders and so on, we felt that we really need to make a step forward. And that's what explains essentially the German government's and the French president's initiative to do a meaningful change as to our crisis response in the economic way, that we would say yes to common European debt. And that shows that in a moment of crisis, people become aware of the necessity of bolder action, and that this is possible, even if it is difficult, in a multilateral framework. And like that, you can make more of a difference than even a rather big nation state in the European context, as Germany could do.
Right, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And here, of course, the trust the trust point comes back in. What you mentioned in your introduction, because I think by cooperating and tackling COVID-19, I think we can not only end the pandemic hopefully faster when we cooperate, but also when we can rebuild trust. And I think trust is of utmost importance right now. People need to have hope in the system, need to have hope in their states, but also we need to really increase resilience with a view to future crises is also what comes next.
When the crisis hit, who was it you spoke to on the Europe? What was your first who were your first port of calls?
First in our government itself, of course. But then, of course, with our neighbours, as I mentioned, with Austria, Switzerland, with Germany, we were in close contact all the time. Because the smaller the country, the more important, as I mentioned. And so at the end of the day, you need to build resilience. You need to cooperate in that term. And it worked very well in our geographic area. But we heard about other geographic areas where it didn't really work and the countries totally closed down. And so for us, that was a very crucial moment where we really had to be in close contact with our neighbours and also for our borders. We didn't close the borders to Switzerland because there aren't any, and that was never discussed. So that's also some sign of strength, where we really feel the many years of cooperating are lasting even in times of crisis.
But the border with Austria did
the border with Austria did close, but we had a very, very solid solution for the many Austrian that come into that really travel to Liechtenstein every day for work. We have many of those. We call them pendlers, and we have many of those every day that really come in the country and then leave again in the evening. And that worked really solid solution.
And there was very, very few cases in Liechtenstein of the actual disease. It was an early spate, and then it abated. I was there in the summer, and there was none at that point. And now it's ticked up again slightly, but
still in low numbers, but we're grateful about.
Right.
But also the health system, and that comes to the point what you mentioned earlier. We have a good health system in our area, what we are grateful about. And that's also an asset right now in such times of crisis.
Actually, when you look back a few years, when we discussed why the support for the European Union might be going down in our populations, the politicians resorted to the question saying, we made so much progress, there's so much in for people, they can travel freely, they don't need passports, there's no borders, they don't need to change money and all that stuff, why aren't they more grateful for it? And now with this crisis, we suddenly see what an achievement that was. 'Cause, I mean, many people grew up, younger generations grew up not having to show their passports inside, and suddenly the experience was back something that was like in the old days, in the 60s or in the 50s, that you couldn't even cross if you didn't have a special permit. That was a look into the abyss. And I think no nation state took these decisions lightly, although it was something that was in its toolbox. And might be something to show off to your population that you do something. At the same time, you experience how seriously you're challenging the very foundations of the whole system that we're resting on. And that's no longer only the nation state, but it's also the European Union. And you don't want to endanger that.
And it's been a remarkably swift change as well. I mean, I can remember thinking in February, or maybe it was March, when the Italian authorities suddenly announced Milan and the surrounding area was going to be locked down. That was astounding that a city in Europe was going to be shut down. And then within 6 weeks, everywhere, more or less, was locked down. So there was a huge cognitive shift, I think, for people as well that this pandemic caused. But as you were just saying, Ambassador, there's maybe an opportunity there as well, because it's reminding people of the benefits of the EU.
I agree, and the freedom of movement is something that we were used to. It was part of our everyday life to travel, and it really showed also to me that often discussions or events can be held online. It's not the same, of course. I much prefer the dialogue we're having today than if we would have it online via one of those video conferencing systems that really popped up. Got lots of members over the last couple of months because it was the only way to communicate with the world. But at the same time, it shows also how important it is to see each other again and to build on meeting each other personally, because I always feel first intervention is always the best when we see each other in person, and then we can build on with video conferencing. Yeah. But specifically in the political field, it's of utmost importance to meet and to discuss at a table and in some kind of trusted
There's a lot that you don't get just by camera or by phone or whatever. You kind of miss a lot of the connection. And the trust is a trust issue as well, I think.
But that's also
we miss our audience too.
Right, exactly. But it's true. I mean, I was sort of wondering when the sort of call came through, could I help moderate a panel? And then you kind of think, well, when moderating, and I'm sure when speaking as well, you sort of miss maybe picking up on the reaction a little bit in the room. But so
that's a missing voice then in this transformation as such.
It's like a sort of Greek chorus in a play that you kind of it's there to give you the democratic feedback. Just staying on the sort of issue of trust, which is obviously core to all of this. Are we not missing? I mean, is there not going to be a serious challenge to public trust in these institutions, which is already pretty low? As the economic effects of this crisis really bite. And I mean, I think we're seeing that in a way play out in real time in the US, where there were already clearly these fractures in society, and it was already very divided. And now this crisis and the whole economic order, the economic effect of it, the huge unemployment in the States, that kind of thing is really, and the election coming up imminently, of course, that's really showing maybe what things could be like elsewhere around the world in a few months' time. Do you think?
I mean, it wasn't easy decisions for any politician out there, I guess, over the last couple of months. The tough measures we had to take to really protect our population, it was needed. But I guess no one took those easily. And so definitely, of course, we are in turmoil. The world is in turmoil. We don't know if a second wave, a third wave is coming our way soon, specifically when colder months are arriving. And I just feel, for us, it really, the government stick together even more during that time. We, inside the government, I could feel that we took those decisions together. We've discussed them in depth, and we've really tried to do the best for our population.
And publicly in Liechtenstein, the population they're happy with the government's handling of the crisis? Of
course, the unemployment, as I mentioned in my introduction, is coming our way at some point, probably soon, and we have to also deal with that situation then. And the economies suffered, as we already see. Not only specific industries, I think all industries as a whole have suffered at some point somehow. And this will come our way soon, specifically the unemployment that will rise also in our country, Liechtenstein. But at the same time, people could understand that it was for their benefit at the first point. You only have a health once, and you're healthy when you are, and once you aren't anymore, and specifically those that were caught by, overnight by the virus and felt ill the next day, we could help. We had space in our hospitals. But there are hospitals that were overloaded, and when there is no space for you and you cannot be treated the way you need to be treated, then you realize that the health is the only thing you need. It's the most important, definitely. And so we could feel that, and our population, that's also why they understood the situation very well. But we also see the turmoils that Berlin is having. Not only, but specifically the Berlin ones 2 days ago that were pretty intense, and where you can feel that people also get angry at the system, and I think that's something we shouldn't undermine, definitely.
I mean, what is peculiar about the coronavirus is it's not a foreign actor. The threat is hard to personify even if you call the virus as if it was coming from Wuhan.
Yeah, the Wuhan virus.
Just the temptation is there to make it an actor, but it's not an actor. That's one thing. And second is, I think in none of our societies has there been a discussion about if government was culpable of what happened. It just came everywhere. Even in Italy, where the impact was harshest, there's not necessarily a debate that it was the Italian government that didn't do the right thing. It was a natural catastrophe that came over us. And that is something completely different from the crises and the crisis responses that we expected we might confront in our lifetime. That's something totally new and a loss of control. In a way, as it is disquieting, it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is holding the government responsible for the crisis to arise. And that's a big difference. That does not change, as you mentioned, the attitude that by and large the people will ask if the crisis response is adequate and effective. And so if you lose your job and you stay healthy, you may say that was the wrong priority that was set on health because I'm healthy anyway, but I've lost my job. Those are the questions. Plus, what you see, we had several thousand demonstrators in Berlin, we had a few hundred in Vienna. What is going on in the United States, we've been seeing. There is, in a diverse society as ours, a completely different take on what is appropriate and how much infringement on personal liberties is supportable and not. Put on top of that the usual conspiracy theories and so on, which are a breeding ground for any sort of criticism, and you have to live with that. By and large, my hunch is that the German people are more or less satisfied with the way that we've been dealing with them. They're getting wary, like every population everywhere around the globe, because the infringements on their way of life are severe. But I think European governments managed fairly well to cope with the crisis so far.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the fear is that when we go through, if we go through a second set of lockdowns, what effect does that have on people's perception of what the government is doing? It was an interesting conversation at dinner last night where a colleague was pointing out that they didn't know anyone that had been infected with coronavirus, but they did know 4 people that had lost their jobs. And that particularly for young people as well. I think there's a real issue here where lots of countries now. I'm not based in the UK, but I keep abreast of the press in the UK. Still this huge debate about sending people back to school, people not going to universities yet. I mean, I know elsewhere pupils are back at school, but clearly around the world there's this potential for almost a sort of generation of people that will be disjointed by this, young people. The economic opportunities were already fairly thin on the ground, and now maybe even less so. So there's a huge sort of second-order economic effect, and as we've seen from the last financial crisis and the euro crisis, the consequences of that, I suppose, could be pretty severe. And ultimately, everything ends up being political, really. Even if it's, as you said, Ambassador, it's not a foreign actor. That didn't stop President Trump trying to paint it as a foreign actor, as the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus and that kind of thing. Do you worry about that sort of rising nationalism in either in Europe or elsewhere, in America, in Russia in particular, I suppose, would be the other place that it's maybe particularly damaging at the moment?
If I worry at the moment, we have a different system at home, and I can only tell that we are proud of how we manage the situation, but I really feel that access to healthcare is crucial and needs to be here for years. And that's not a given all over the globe at the moment. And I think that's what frightens me the most, that governments really need to have that point in mind over years to come, because for me also better coordination throughout with the different governments. I think that could also help in a future crisis as such. And I take these points, but we at home, we have a different system, and so for us. But maybe you have a more broader view and in terms of what do you feel from out of Vienna.
Yeah.
But
I think I would have been more skeptical a few months ago if you'd asked me about the resurgence of nationalism, because at that time everybody was really trying to guard his interests very, very narrowly. But I think the overall impression in European polities seems to be that we're better off if our neighbors are better off. The interconnectedness of our economies, that was at the root of the German debate about this turnaround in the debt question, that we felt if Italy goes down, our economy is going to go down too. And that was, I think, carried the day in countries like Austria that was more skeptical as well. So the interdependence got noted, and we tried to address that. At the same time, what we probably have to keep in mind that maybe how to call that in a very broad sense, the terms of trade might change, that countries try to apply to further relations, that they rather guard their interests and pay more for it. The Austrian government has a strategy they call wirtschaftliche Landesverteidigung, economic territorial defense, so to say, which is not in a narrow sense to be applied, but rather saying we want to see that crucial products, critical infrastructure remain under control of our nation state. And I think the challenge is inside the European Union to make clear that this sort of economic defense better takes place in a European surrounding at a level and not at a nation state one, because we're better off. And that means production of health products, of medicine and whatever has to take place to a greater extent and a greater cost. That's the question of the terms of trade inside the European Union, so that we do not depend to such an extent on the production in some remote corner of the world that we do not have access to in times of crisis. So we have to strike a new balance between what is going to be globalized and somewhere, and how much the nation state or respectively the European Union is going to take charge of the control of those things.
I mean, that's still quite a difficult challenge, isn't it, though, when you look, if you think about the disparity in economic exports of Eurozone members, their different interests around the world. One country might have particularly strong connections to Russia, for example, and so embargoes or sanctions can disproportionately impact different groups within the EU, and therefore that sort of ends up creating a tension, doesn't it? That you have to arrive at a consensus, which is ultimately going to end up sometimes punishing different members, and particularly with a lot of the newer Eastern Bloc members, that seems to be something that's causing friction at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed, but there are also positive signs throughout that crisis, looking at the digital transformation that we just kind of lived through. I think there's also hope that at least there are some good positive signs that we can take out of this time. E-commerce, fintech, also all those technological and video conferencing systems and so on. So
I mean, that's really that we haven't really touched on it.
It's not a voice of kind of transformation, where I feel that really
exactly. I mean, that sort of points to the topic of this discussion, which is about voices of transformation, and really that digital revolution in the last 6 or 7 years has completely changed the way that politicians and all kinds of policymakers think about how to engage with people, and maybe the way in which when people express their views as well, through social media. And the rise of a lot of right-wing populist movements has been fueled by, and extremist movements as well, has been fueled by social media, as well as positive opportunities for engagement. In Liechtenstein, how does the government engage with citizens on a daily basis? I mean, how engaged are the population? Is there a strong kind of social media community? How does the government?
There is throughout. Of course, the government is built by consensus. We make decisions by consensus, the 5 of us, and we are very close to the citizens. So we've always been in touch with them. We've always discussed with them through social media, through the video conferencing systems that arose, but not only, also through possibilities by speaking to them just on the street, because this country is really small, that we are close together, and that helped also. I think we always heard the feedback from the citizens pretty quickly and could react to it. And I think that helped also to really make the right decisions over the last couple of months that were intense for all of us, because we really we've really been closely cooperating with our neighbors. That was important for us. But we also support calls of regional approaches as a whole. I mean, for us, the current crisis has been used for us to also explore regional solutions to border issues in order to really mitigate negative effects on the economy as well as on social and family life. And so we've really been in close touch with them also to get feedback. And I think feedback also in times of crisis is the utmost. It's important to listen and to discuss, not only to make decisions without keeping the voice of the citizens.
But I mean, feedback is seductive in a way. That's one of my issues with social media, because there is a lot of feedback, and you tend to take this as the feedback of the people. But not everybody's on social media, and every transformation leaves substantial groups of the population behind. All those. I mean, I get letters from ordinary people in Austria who are not on social media, who don't even use computers, and write letters and read newspapers. Yes. Yeah. So this is their way of response, which is very slow, not very emotional, but rather deliberate when you sit down and write a letter. But these people exist. And we shouldn't be seduced by the availability of social media feedback, thinking that this is the feedback of the people. Because it's like having 50,000 followers is nice, but it's 50,000. I mean, in Liechtenstein it's something different. It's 37,000 inhabitants.
There aren't 50,000
but in Germany it's like, but it's always just a percentage of the population that you reach, and not everybody reads every feed. So we have to be cautious in this digital transformation when it comes to interaction with the people. How do we really reach them? And I think it's an interesting development in this corona situation, how election campaigns are being held and elections take place. In October there's a very important election in Austria, in Vienna, and the election campaign is going to take place in a very different environment. I'm really interested in seeing how this evolves, if electronic campaigning, how that works, if you have your audience only via television or social media, and what impression does that convey to you as a campaigner, and what the feedback, which is essentially at the ballot box, will look like.
Yes, yeah.
That's
True.
a very analog feedback.
True.
Yeah,
True.
it is.
True.
I mean, what do you think with the Viennese election? How do you think that the crisis will change the politics themselves? You know, is it becoming a political issue, the way the government has handled the crisis in Austria?
Well, I mean, like in every country, the way I see it in Austria, and I think when I'm reading German papers a lot too, and European ones such as yours, the response is every government is under scrutiny and essentially being held responsible. How is it performing now? I mean, and as you usually see in election campaigns, you are not voters don't take decision based on the merits of your party or the leaders, what they did before, but what the people expect them to do in the future. Their crisis solution potential is going to be evaluated. And of course, with a crisis such as this at hand, the two main issues, how do you cope with the health crisis and how do you cope with the economic crisis, are the main issues. And that goes down to a local or a state level, as well as it is, of course, rooted in the debate at the federal level. Mm.
Why have masks, for example, become a symbol for right-wing populism, do you think? In the States in particular, you see that a lot, but also here in Europe, there was a little protest in Zurich the other day. It's relatively small, but obviously in Berlin there have been bigger protests. I think in Vienna there was a protest the other day against masks. What does that tell us about the way that this crisis is interacting with that kind of anger among people about institutions and multilateralism?
I think the masks are a symbol of this crisis. It's just part of the crisis. Yeah. We weren't used to them. Colleagues from other regions have been used to masks since early on, right. But we really haven't been used to. For us, it was a total new surrounding, having people around you that wear masks, and I think it's the symbol of the crisis that arose of it. And what you just mentioned before with the elections, the Vienna elections in October, but then also the US elections. Just spoke of them exactly as well. When you say that we are really looking what happens in the future, we are hopeful for all the arguments that bring what they want to change in the future. And I think that's also worrisome to me at some point. For some elections to come, and you only look at what comes next instead of what really happened, and why did we end up where we are right now?
I totally agree. I mean, it's one thing if we manage our transformation in Europe well. And the other thing is what transformations on the global stage in our immediate neighborhood, but also on the world stage, are going to affect us. Today, the High Representative of of Europe's foreign policy, Mr. Borrell, wrote a piece, an op-ed, saying that Europe has to become a geopolitical actor because all the others do, and they care less and less for norms and rules, and infringements are multiplying. And with respect to our eastern neighbors and southeastern neighbors, Turkey and Russia, we feel the heat immensely across the Mediterranean, also on our eastern borders. And so whatever transformation we do inside the European Union to become more effective and keep our legitimacy also has to address this big challenge. We're all in a situation where we see that the institutions and the power balances that made sure that we were in a rather comfortable situation are going downhill, and I think the American election is very important for that, but it's not the only one. It's not the only change that's taking place, and we can't change the world to the extent that maybe we thought 20 years ago, or affect the course of events. But we have to prepare and be prepared for a world where we are no longer, so to say, dominant or hegemonic. If you imagine a world that's going to have 10 billion inhabitants in 2050, how can you really expect that a continent with 500 million is going to be one of the dominant players, and that maybe the Gs, the great countries, we had G7, now we're talking about G2, might be completely different actors than now. And the only thing that we can do is try to keep up with our transformation as quickly as possible in order to prepare for such a world.
Indeed. And here we come back to the platforms that we mentioned at the beginning on the United Nations SDGs, the Agenda 2030 and so on. If we don't take those seriously, then that will be the next crisis to come. Climate change, everything that got lost over the last couple of months because there just wasn't enough space in the newspapers. All of those topics will be back up, and of course the world could at the moment kind of get a bit better because we weren't traveling as much. We kind of stayed in our own countries for most of the time, and that helped specifically the beautiful nature that we have on this earth. But at the same time, we're probably back up in our old life again pretty soon once the health system helped us with some medicine or with even a vaccine. And at the end of the day, we're probably back up in our old life pretty soon again.
And then climate change
is going to be there. Yes, exactly.
I can think the beginning of this year, I was sort of thinking, well, the FT's, one of our priorities is to be writing a lot more about sustainability, things like that. And then all of a sudden, no, the last 5 months, everyone's had to become a health expert of sorts. But on that, just on that issue of how we need multilateral institutions to solve all these crises, both as Europeans and as international world citizens, it's still a problem though, isn't it? Because even in Europe now, as you, Ambassador, mentioned, on our doorstep, there are crises which we don't have the tools to address at the moment. I mean, what's happening in Belarus at the moment, that is a prime example of, that there's a sort of, on the one hand, we're sort of in trouble, the EU is in trouble if it intervenes and sort of condemns the actions of the government there, and on the other hand, if it does nothing equally, there's a sort of sense in which it's abandoned people who are protesting against an authoritarian regime that is abusing human rights. How does the EU strike that balance between principles and safeguarding its place in the world and the sort of well-being of its citizens? Or is that a false contrast?
No, I mean, but it's really. I mean, you say the word. It's really a balancing act, because what you have to see, for instance, just to go on with the example Belarus, there's no European flags at the demonstrations.
Right.
That's a big difference to Ukraine. The Ukraine demonstration 2014 were all about being part of the European Union and the European community as such. Belarus is an issue rather focusing that the demonstrators obviously are no longer satisfied with the government they have. And that's more of an internal thing, and we are worried that it might be an invitation for foreign interventions that might be disastrous to the stability and the well-being of that country. But it's not about the European perspective, which also gives us an idea that not everything is centered on the European Union to an extent that we thought was evident. Whenever there was a problem or a crisis such as that on the margins of Europe, we thought, yeah, European Union is going to enlarge and address that issue by that. That's no longer the case to such an extent. So maybe we have to become more modest in that regard. At the same time, and those are the other examples that we are discussing or might be discussing in Libya and Syria, things that are happening right at our doorstep, are not necessarily within our reach to such an extent that obviously has to do with other nations' stronger willingness to use force, a military force, whereas we rather refrain from that and do not believe in military solutions to such an extent, but others do. And that is a challenge to our strategic disposition. If they think military solutions work to their benefit, they will pursue those, and we cannot only limit ourselves to saying that this might not be a stable solution, while others are pushing that forward. So there are challenges to our self-understanding and also the way that we operate crises that we cannot neglect and just say that the way that we've been doing that for decades is the only way. We have to live with the challenges that are being posed by middle powers. I don't want to say that derogatively in any way, or say that very agile nation states that freely use military force to bolster their interests. And we haven't really found an easy way or an innovative way to deal with that. So in our immediate neighborhood, we really have to get our act together and find a new consensus on how to address that, or maybe lower expectations to a certain extent, that it's not something that Brussels can fix.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's exactly the point. It's kind of a new ground at some point because it's a crisis of identity. And the question there is kind of, are you part of the European Union? Do you feel it's more internal? And then also Brussels can solve some of them, but for sure not all of them.
I mean, it feels a bit like you're playing a board game with all of your brothers and sisters or whatever, but you're the only one that's obeying the rules and everyone else is cheating. But that's very frustrating, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, if the EU, which is obviously committed to an international rules-based order, how on earth do you confront, you very diplomatically referred to, but let's just, I don't know, say Russia. How do you deal with powers like that are apparently revisionist, that do not seem to wish to obey international rules? I don't know. I mean, just playing devil's advocate as well. I'm sure people from Moscow would say, well, hang on a minute. What about the Iraq War? What about Afghanistan? There wasn't much evidence of international rules-based consensus with those interventions either. So, are we reaping what we sowed, the West, in a way?
Actually, I think I don't want to be too pessimistic, because if you look at, for instance, two major crises that evolved over the last 10 to 15 years, one Ukraine, the other Iran, it's not that we were totally ineffective. The Minsk process held this intervention in Ukraine at bay. It didn't undo the unlawful annexation of Crimea so far, right? There's still a conflict inside Ukraine with the Donbass, but we have found a process that we have the OSCE monitoring mission, so we are present and we hold that conflict at bay on a basis which is not satisfying at all, but it's not that we're completely clueless as to do that. The other one is Iran. For 15 years, this conflict, for almost 15 years, we've been negotiating, ever since they admitted to having violated the NPT in 2003. It took like 12 years to get an agreement, and it's still going on. Now, it's under pressure from within those very nations, the 5 permanent members and Germany who negotiated the deal. But still, it made a difference. But it's very cumbersome.
Yeah, I mean, Iran's a good example, isn't it, of success? But it was successful, the nuclear deal.
Exactly. And what you mentioned earlier on, we're only stronger the stronger our neighbors are. Like, we rely on them. So also we are very much interested in not only the rules-based order, but also the human rights as a whole, and to really find solutions for these existing conflicts and maybe new conflicts that will arise out of COVID-19. But we also shouldn't forget about. I mean, the world is in turmoil at the moment, and people are going on the streets. You mentioned Hong Kong very quickly in your intro. I feel, that people want to be heard. Of course, in social media, there's only a small amount of people that can raise their voice, but people want to be heard, so they go on the streets, and we see that even more and more probably also to come. And we need to be ready and prepared for that, and we need to have answers. And that's why we need to cooperate even more in the next month to come, because there are not going to be easier months ahead of us. There are probably going to be more intense ones when people realize the unemployment, as your friends, or the conversation you had yesterday evening with the 5 people that are unemployed, or know people that are unemployed, but they don't even know anyone who has COVID-19. So it's going to be a pretty tough time ahead of us.
I mean, it's in a way, it's a question of priorities. What are the challenges that you really face? We as European Union members, and Liechtenstein, if I may join you into this group, on a global stage, we are rich and healthy. We are really well off. We are the envy of the world. We live in diversity and huge welfare, social security, and so on. But it could be better. It could always be better, and it's gone a bit down before. Question is, how important is what to you? What are your priorities? Is the only thing that you have a job, that you're healthy? Is that also your way of life? That's the mask thing that people are debating about. What is more important to me? Rather run the risk of sickness, or wear a mask and feel to do something that I don't want to do? And you can have that on a global stage as well. Are you just happy with free travel and not changing money? Is that what Europe is about? Or is it about a way of life, a way that states interact with each other, about rule of law, about diversity, freedom of speech, same rights? And is that something that we need to protect in a world where these rules and laws are less and less respected, and the values and principles that lay behind that are being called into question? And what, essentially, are we willing to invest in order to do that? Are we willing to invest more money, more military, more force, in order to protect these interests? Or do we just think they are certain anyway, like good weather, climate, or whatever? Or do we really have to fight for that? And that maybe is the great transformational change that we're facing, and COVID is maybe adding a few impulses and disorienting in a way, and we're not sure how that will play out. But essentially, it's a question that our societies have to answer. What is very important? What is less important? Where do we put money, muscle, and power behind?
I mean, isn't the big cleavage really generational? That a lot of the crisis already has disproportionately, financial or political, has disproportionately affected younger people. Certainly in the West, and elsewhere as well, where there's been the impact of the economic crisis. And now COVID is sort of doing the same. I mean, although obviously the imperative is just to safeguard public health, in terms of who is economically impacted, it's the young who are disproportionately impacted by this. And yet, ironically, also the young who are the least impacted by the disease itself. And that tension feels like it's an existing fault line economically that maybe this might worsen. And so governments need answers for young people, don't they?
They do. That's why also it's so important to have the young also here in Alpbach. I really think it's important to include them in the discussions, in the dialogues, and you have to set the right priorities for the next months and years to come, definitely, and we shouldn't forget the young in all decisions we are making. Future ones, past ones, definitely. I think that's something government needs to have as a top priority on their agenda.
I mean, there's a big demographic shift in Europe and the West in general. The sort of crisis
we
of
saw
an
it
aging
also,
population.
and we saw it with Brexit and so on. Definitely, yes.
I mean, essentially it's a question of solidarity. young people showed a great solidarity with the vulnerable elderly groups when the crisis came up. We everybody protected those who were likely more severely affected. And that solidarity has to be kept, but everybody has to chip in order to keep that solidarity. I think the next waves of Corona will really challenge the solidarity and also our ability to react flexibly. I mean, all these discussions that we're having about regional differentiation, the traffic light solutions that are being discussed in Austria are all about flexible responses, because nobody wants to have a repeat lockdown. So, and the question is, do you differentiate between vulnerabilities, territories, and so on? Because you don't want to have everybody and everything locked down in case the next crisis comes. And like the German government established early on a devolution of the decision down to county level in order to make sure that if there is an outbreak in one region, not the whole state or even the whole nation would be affected. But it's very difficult and it takes meticulous planning. Sometimes it goes down to one house or one street. But the willingness of people who are not living in that street to go into lockdown might evaporate quickly. So we have to tread really carefully in your next responses, and I think that's one of the challenges our governments are facing.
Exactly. And we shouldn't forget too quickly what you just mentioned with the solidarity. That was so nicely seen all over the globe during the pandemic, where the youngers really helped the elderly to support and went for grocery store, went to grocery stores to get food for them and so on. And that was done without the government at the end of the day.
Right.
It wasn't
was
the government.
Action, yeah.
It was responsible action. It wasn't the government that told the young people, you need to do that right now. It was and their own belief to do something and to help the ones in need. And that's also something we saw in the crisis. Unfortunately, the poor were taken the hardest, and it's again something where we need to be very careful with that scissor you mentioned. We are living in more solid surrounding. We have among richer people around us. Yes, indeed. You see that all over the globe, but of course in our region, it's also it's also a given, and we need to be careful in that regard, that the scissor is not getting any bigger, because that would also be very, very worrisome for our future of the world. Because the poor were Syria and so on, we saw it, they already have a conflict and they got COVID on top of. And that's really something that keeps me up at night, where I feel, what can we do against those regions on the earth where they already suffer and they have a crisis on top.
I mean, solidarity seems to be the sort of really key element in all of these, you know, and so I don't just want to sort of let it stand alone as a liberal shibboleth that solidarity is just a progressive thing, because of course I think that's also key to the rise of a lot of right-wing and extremist movements is a belief that they are providing solidarity for the people that support them, a sense of connection to and change and identity. You know, those are groups of people that are turning to those kind of more disruptive politics because the existing system doesn't provide a sense of solidarity for them. And obviously in a country like Liechtenstein, where the government and the people are very closely connected, and similarly in Switzerland in a way, maybe that makes for more solidarity. But larger countries, you know, maybe that's a challenge for democratic systems in larger countries. How do you continue to manufacture solidarity in a time of great economic and political stress? I don't know.
Being responsive and feeling responsible. Need to put the citizens in the middle and really not only give them hope and trust that they do the right thing, also support them in what they do. But of course the impacts they're having showed them that they did the right thing over the last couple of months, definitely.
Well, I think by and large I would say federal and democratic countries are better because they depend, they try to to work with system of devolution where power and responsibility are close to the people, and at the same time regular elections give the best impression of voter or citizens' content, and a possibility for citizens to engage themselves. Whereas I'd say autocratic regimes have a harder time trying to really gauge how far they can go and what the response is, because essentially they're about repressing that response until it erupts, as we see in Belarus.
Or in the US, to be frank.
Yeah.
I mean, right now there's a real challenge to people's faith in the democratic system in the US, don't you think?
It is. It is, and they need to foster trust. Definitely. It's of utmost importance for the next, specifically until the elections.
How important do you think what is happening in the US is now, both in terms of the outcome of the election, but just what the messaging for the rest of the world is about the way it's being conducted, Ambassador?
Well, I think, we're all used to the experience that things that happen in America, by and large, will come to us too. I hope this year we'll make an exception, that we're having an open debate before the election, if the election might be rigged, is something that I'm not used to in Western democracies, I must say. But the ultimate test will be the election and how the results will be counted, how the handover of power is going to work, and so on. So I'm still optimistic. I'm an old friend of the United States. I'm a true believer in the democratic checks and balances, and still am. And that the American public is discussing with such an energy, if the system is good, is still a sign that it's vibrant. Because if there was no debate, it would be more difficult, I'd say. So it's alive and kicking, maybe more kicking than we would have expected. But the test, it's alive. It's very much alive. And I wouldn't judge that before the election and the results. Of course, people are concerned, and I mean the very president is concerned, and others are concerned for different reasons or for that reason. That's very hard to say. We've been having issues with U.S. elections, 2000, the Florida recount, that were solved in court, and the case was over. If this is going to evolve on a legal level or on a political level, that's up to the future. It's very hard for me to say that in this small alpine village.
Yeah, I mean, but I can still remember, hanging chads, the little punctured holes in the Florida ballots. I mean, but the fact that I can still remember such a, and that seems an age.
You were a child then, yeah.
Well, not nearly. I was at university, but yeah, no, but that still resonates. The idea of that, but that's so small compared with what we're now seeing in the US, which is a much more widespread sense that. Rightly or wrongly, who knows, but a lot of people on both sides of the political divide don't have faith in the system. Just to change tack, I have to ask you, because it popped into my head, Ambassador, do you think Donald Trump charmed Chancellor Merkel, as was claimed the other week?
What was her response?
I think she said she didn't discuss private matters.
I think it was rather taciturn.
Right, yeah. I am surprised. Anyway, it seems that we are constantly returning to this issue of faith and trust in institutions. If there is one thing that, on a European level, both in for your own countries and more broadly on the EU level, that needs to change or that could change, is there a single thing, a magic bullet, if you will, to borrow a medical term in these highly medical times, that would help to restore trust or begin the path to getting people back on board with the European project, or the sort of sense of democracy being a functioning system? Yeah,
I mean, you mentioned faith and trust in institutions, but specifically for me also in politics. And I think it's it's of utmost importance to really learn out of this crisis, to really go back and look at what happened and how did we react and what could we have done better, and to really take all those learnings into should the next crisis arise, whatever the next crisis could be, a cyber crisis the world wouldn't be prepared of, as well. Like, we haven't been prepared for this one at all, but there are lots of other things, shutdown of the World Wide Web. There's a lot that could happen, and we should really take this as a learning process, and really we should really reflect, and we shouldn't forget what happened. That's often the case. Humanity often forgets quickly, and we shouldn't in this moment, because we've been writing history anew. Although history is repeating itself, we've seen a similar crisis 100 years ago, Spanish flu, and of course the digital transformation that happened since has been a big asset. But we've done lots of similar mistakes again, the way we've done it 100 years ago, and I think we should really start to learn, take this as a learning process, and get stronger should the next crisis arise. And for me, what I learned specifically is to really cooperate, to not shut down, to really stay open. We could have cooperated even better with all the apps that rose out of this pandemic. The COVID apps that arose. If we had cooperated a bit better, we probably would have been faster. We've done it, and then once you traveled, you were in Germany or in Austria, the app didn't work any longer. That we should be better in these parts. But there's a lot we can take from this crisis. There's a lot we can learn from it, and I really hope governments look back in this regard, and that they take it as a learning process.
Yeah, politicians almost as distrusted as journalists now.
I wouldn't go that far.
Well, politics needed the media specifically in the last couple of months, and the cooperation there worked, I feel, but still, of course, the media is the voice of the world at some point. And
Actually, I do agree with what you say about the effectiveness of government, certainly. But if we compare European Union and the US situation, and that's where we came from in this segment of our debate, the question that is being discussed in America so fiercely is the question: do we trust the institution to be a representation of what the people want? Is it legitimate in that way? So, I mean, from a political science perspective, there's essentially two things that legitimate a government. One is more output-centered, and the other one more input-centered. Output is being effective. You're a good government if you deliver the goods, like the Singapore model. Well-governed polity, everything works, managerial standards, people are happy because life is good. Input into government, limited compared to our models. I think our legitimacy and the acceptance very much is based, despite the question that our governments really deliver, and we are living in prosperous countries that are the envy of the world, where refugees and migrants from all over the world try to get. This is an impressive balance as to the output. But I think unique about our system is the input legitimacy, that people think they can make a difference, that by their votes and by their other contributions as citizens, they have a stake and have a say in that. And so what governments need always to do in our Western democracies is to make sure that the voice of the people is being heard in different ways, be that via media, via demonstrations, or the ballot box. And as long as our governments are responsive in that way, they are not only legitimate and able to restore or maintain trust, but also to be a bit better than other systems that are non-democratic and do not have the participatory structures that we enjoy.
Yeah, there's E.M. Forster essay, 2 Cheers for Democracy. Not 3 because it's not perfect, but it's certainly better than everything else. So, that still is the great challenge of our times, isn't it? Trying to persuade people that this complex, messy, democratic model, with all of its flaws, is still the most legitimate, because it's still the best way of getting of bringing everybody along together, rather than allowing people to be seduced by a lot of the other kind of the false promises. And those false promises are sort of so endemic at the moment, the whole fake news, to use a very overused term. But that's the sort of big problem. And there is a challenge as well from the sort of authoritarian model where, you know, as you were saying, Ambassador, the delivery model when it works, the sort of Singapore model, but also the sort of Chinese model, I suppose, as well. And there, you know, maybe it's too early to say, but certainly their handling of the crisis early on seemed to be quite effective. You know, the World Health Organization certainly thought so. So maybe there's been a boost to that model as well. I don't know, but it's an interesting time in which there is this kind of polarity between systems.
Well, it's good. There is a certain competition between different models, and it's always a question that maybe this one model seems to prevail in the short term. Which one is going to prevail in the long term? And I think the jury is still out which system will have better. As to the question, which sort of COVID management, how intrusive, and what results will there be, as to mortality rates, economic impact, and so on, it's just too early to tell. But there is certainly a competition, and I think we as Western democracies can be very self-confident entering that competition. But we always have to keep in mind, we have to be open to responses and not neglect what people are saying.
Is the democratic model better because the pandemic ultimately is it's non-political in a sense as a disease, and you can't hide the numbers ultimately? I mean, does it? The response is judged. It's quite a plain barometer or a plain rule against which to judge government's effectiveness, because the death rate is the death rate and the hospitalisation rate is the hospitalisation rate, and no matter how much what you say, or is that too simplistic a reading?
It's also the testing numbers that we saw that.
That's, I mean, not to quote Churchill too often, but it's the statistic that you did not forge, or you do forge, is that trustworthy? I mean, the death rates. I mean, what is a COVID-related death or not?
And what is,
if you don't test, if you don't say the numbers, we are totally unaware of death rates and test cases and whatever in very many countries of the world. So competition is not on an equal footing. So that statistics are kind of difficult to gauge the success of a country.
But I suppose what I mean is, you know, somewhere like Brazil, for example, where, you know, the statistics, in a sense, regardless of whether they're entirely accurate or not, don't lie, and so the government can't hide from, you know, that maybe peddlers of fake news, or in the US as well, you know, it doesn't really matter what you say, what the president has claimed. The fact is the crisis is not under control, and it doesn't matter how many times he says that the US is beating the world, it is not. And ultimately that is something that people become more and more aware of. So in that sense, you know, maybe the tendency is towards the side of truth, you know, as a result of the pandemic. And maybe it's a small mercy, I don't know.
Yeah, but COVID also has taken over the flu at some point.
Right.
You know, I mean, we didn't really have any flu numbers recently. So there is a mix at the end of the day, I would say. And of course, we've been honest with our numbers. We have, because for us it was important to have the numbers as a given and to be transparent in that regard. But transparency, of course, in this crisis is also a big topic of debate.
Yeah. Great. Probably a good point on which to end, I think. I don't know how much time we've run for, but I think we've kind of run around the topic, which was already very broad. We've touched on most areas. I'm slightly conscious that we didn't really discuss a lot of the Asian experience of the pandemic, and also a lot of the stuff that's going on there at the moment with China and Hong Kong. But that probably reflects our briefs here in a relatively small alpine part of Europe that between the three of us we're based in. So. Thank you very much for coming and for joining me today to discuss this. It's been really interesting speaking with you both, and I hope for everyone else as well watching, it's been productive and interesting for them too.
Thank you.
Thank you.